wisdom and teaches with the Somatics and Phenomenology program at the Fielding Graduate University. Evi is a founder of the discipline of women's studies. Its national organization, yes, and two of its caucuses, Jewish and lesbian. Among her groundbreaking writings are Kafka and the Yiddish Theater, its impact on his work, and Nice Jewish Girls, a lesbian anthology, which was the first volume to challenge homophobia among Jews and anti-Semitism among lesbians. Her work includes translations from the Yiddish of Isaac Bashevis Singer and a comparative study of the life and work of Franz Kafka and Frida Kahlo. Pioneered courses in Jewish women's studies, and after retirement, so-called retirement, don't believe it for a minute, she is engaged with the wise aging movement, especially here, Temple Micah, and focuses on the healing power of art, especially poetry and sacred circle dance, which she teaches internationally every week, no matter what, between 10 and 12. Come to Temple Micah, this very room, and have your dancing shoes on. It will make you feel so wonderful, as well as sacred, and the music, and all right. So let me just make one more plug. Evi will also be facilitating a workshop at our Wise Aging Retreat, the 4th annual Wise Aging Retreat, the last weekend of June. So please think about signing up. The number of rooms have become quite limited. So without further ado, my Evi.
Oh, wait, before, can you all hear me now?
Kind of.
We have to test the equipment. Is the
We can't
first
see
thing.
you over
It's working? Oh, am I all right?
They
with
can
the
hear you, but they
camera?
can't see you.
What?
They can hear you, but they can't see you.
Who can see me?
If you stand behind the machine, you need step.
How's that?
Step stool.
Okay. Uh-oh, I just unplugged the PowerPoint after we spent a very long time putting it together. David, it unplugged. Something unplugged. Oh, there. All right, well, I usually walk around a lot. I forgot this is being videotaped, so I'm going to try to stand still. First of all, a deep breath. Aside from the fact that we've had to work on the electronics, I'd like to say I'm very happy and honored to be here, as everybody else who has ever talked on this podium has been honored to be here. I'd like to start with a poem which you should all have a copy of. It's a kind of a Birkat Hamazon, but it also relates to my topic. So I'd like to read it, and if you want to read with me, fine. It's a sort of a prayer. And then all that has divided us will merge, and then compassion will be wedded to power, and then softness will come to a world that was harsh and unkind. And then both men and women will be gentle, and then both women and men will be strong. And then no person will be subject to
Will
another's
everybody
will.
please turn off whatever electrical devices that may go off in the next hour?
Yes,
Thank you.
please.
Thank you.
And
So
then
sorry.
all will be rich and free and varied, and then the greed of some will give way to the needs of many, and then all will share equally in the earth's abundance, and then all will care for the sick and the weak and the old, and then all will nourish the young, and then all will cherish life's creatures, and then everywhere we will be called Eden once again. I began with this poem because it is a prayer and a paradigm of my topic. This poem offers a utopian vision of a world that is whole and healed, a vision that is central to both Jewish thought and to feminism. Judy Chicago, how many of you have heard of her? Oh, good. Is a feminist artist, an activist, whose body of work, such as The Dinner Party, how many of you saw that in its early years? It's now at the Brooklyn Museum for those who have not ever had a chance to see it. The Birth Project and the Holocaust Project. And with these projects, she transformed our understanding of what it could be to be a woman, to be an artist, to create what is called women's art, and she helped us fill in the absence of women in history. She is indeed very well known. She currently has an exhibit at the National Museum of Women in the Arts on her envisioning her own death very bravely, and also the death of many species in this world. So she's very well known, but she's mostly known as a feminist and not as a Jew. Even though she was born Judy Chicago, and when she married, she became Judy Gerowitz. She changed her name at the time that women were getting rid of names that belonged to fathers and husbands, and she wanted to create her own name. So the question is, what happens when she gave herself the name Chicago? We still have the picture that Daniel we need the deep dish pizza here because Judy Chicago is also from Chicago, which is why she gave herself the name Chicago. So what happens when you take away those Jewish markings? That is one of the questions that I'm going to be asking today. So before we go any further, I also want to give a definition of the word feminist, because there are about as many definitions as there are feminists. So I just want to give very briefly what I'm using as the meaning, which is anyone who understands that women in a patriarchal society, which virtually all societies are, where institutional rule is by males, those are oppressed, often disadvantaged, not fully first-class citizens, and the feminist is merely someone who understands this and the means to do something about it to change this. The difficulties come in where people decide how much has to be changed, how does it have to be changed, how many of the structures of our culture have to be taken away for these changes to happen. So, but I'm using the word very broadly, incorporating everyone who has this belief. So I asked the question, what do we see, what do we not see? The British Marxist historian says we only see what we look at. To look is an act of choice. So I'm choosing to look back at the contributions of Jewish women from the second wave feminism, because our work was hidden from history. Now, that's really not completely true. Our work was not hidden. What was hidden was the fact that so many Jewish women, way disproportionate to our numbers in the population, were active in groups like the earliest liberal groups like Now, where people like Betty Friedan and others were working, but it was also true in the very radical groups, many of whom you probably have never heard of, like New York Red Stockings or New York Radicals. But these groups did not ever talk about being Jewish. It just was not mentioned among them. And we only even know about the fact that so many, it was like a well-kept secret. People knew it, but didn't address it, didn't want to talk about it in any meaningful way. And of course, the question is, why did this happen? This was true in the most radical groups, and it was true in the early liberal groups. It changed after feminism became more multiculturalism. After feminists realized that although women shared very many oppressions, we did not all live the same lives, and that differences of race and ethnicity and geography and all the factors that distinguish us, that's when Jewish women began to realize that they too lived lives that were different. And there are, of course, many intersecting and overlapping factors, and we now use the word, some of you may know it, or you may know it from your children or grandchildren, intersectionality. That was a word that was very popular and very important. So what I'm going to do is try to give you a sense of this whole topic about Jewish women's activism in the second wave. And the second wave goes approximately from the late 60s to the late 80s. So, and you know, you really can't have absolute data, historical phenomena, but that's the approximate time frame. Are we going to have a PowerPoint, by the way? Because if we're not, I'm going to close this.
We'll have to restart the machine, so I didn't want to be up there distracting. But when we're ready, we'll take a 2-minute break and try to do it.
All right, we'll see. So what I want to do to get to this topic of why and what is the meaning of this invisibility, I want to present several contexts, because you don't actually look at any issue from a single vision. So I'm going to have you looking at this context from multiple visions, which will give us a sense of the complexity of it. And then later on, I'm going to decenter the center being Jewish women's activism. So the first context is the open rise in anti-Semitism in the last decade, but speeding up in the last few years. And I'm not going to detail every day, if you're on Facebook or the news, I don't have to detail all the things that are happening, including death, including harassment, including videos that were sent around viciously calling the impeachment a Jew coup, which is a very frightening and terrifying kind of a thing. And that the video, I don't recommend that you watch it, but just to show you, it ends, and next they're coming for you. And it's really right in your face, and so if anyone in any way has an inkling about this, it will affect them deeply. And just this morning, I don't know if you've heard him, that Trump is going to plan to write the fact that Jews will now be considered a nationality. And that is because, ostensibly, because the Civil Rights Act doesn't include religion. And so if people are anti-Semitic, they can't use that to complain. So he's going to write that Jews are a nationality. He plans to announce it today, unless he gets terrible. I don't know if anyone can talk him out of it, but it's really frightening to be used in this way, because the truth is he wants to do it to shut up any criticism of Israel. I mean, that's the subtext of this action. So it's a very frightening time, and it really makes me even wonder about this topic. Should I go ahead and should we be talking about this? I also wanted to bring to everyone's attention that there was very rampant anti-Semitism in the 80s, mostly focused against Jewish women. We did a lot of work decoding and deconstructing the image of the Jewish American princess, which was really a transfer of anti-Semitism combined with sexism from the Jewish male onto the Jewish female. It was rampant even within the Jewish community when girls were, I'm proud to be a Jewish American princess. It even was so harmful to women, it went over into the Black community, and they began calling themselves BAPs, Black American princesses. And unfortunately, the stereotype actually, if you trace back historically, started with with the Marjorie Morningstar, which was the first one. So it's a kind of a scary history that we have. But compared to what's happening now, that felt like a, quote, relatively minor prelude, because we're ending up with much more vicious things. So because of the almost daily rise in anti-Semitism, I come to the history of anti-Semitism in the United States. I don't know how many of you realize, and maybe some of you are experts in this topic, but that prior to World War II, there was open and rampant anti-Semitism in the United States. Hotels could have signs that said no Jews and dogs allowed. There were neighborhoods that Jews could absolutely not move into. If a male applied to medical school, Gesundheit, because women couldn't even apply to medical school and plan to get in. Most men, Jewish men, changed their names. In my own family, there was well, it's my husband's family, my ex-husband's family, was a Beck, and he was a Bakovich, and he became a Beck. And interestingly, my grandson now has taken Bakovich as his name for emails. So the history of anti-Semitism really went underground when news of the concentration camps were opened, and then it was unspeakable. But it never went away. There was never any educational campaign about what anti-Semitism was, what its history was. It simply went underground. My images, it was preserved as if in amber. And now it's surfacing in a particularly virulent way. And then another context, many Gesundheits. The other context, which is important, is that it wasn't in my vita, but that I am a child survivor of the Holocaust. Only my brother, who was here, yay, and I survived. My parents, my father was in a concentration, both Buchenwald and Dachau. I lived under the Nazis. I mean, pretty traumatic history. And of course, it means that everything that's happening today has a different kind of resonance for me, and I wanted you to know that this topic that I'm talking about really affects me. It affects each of us differently, but that's my standpoint. That's one of the other things that feminist theory tells us, is that we all, no matter how hard we try to be, quote, objective, there really is no absolute, and we do bring baggage with us, but the best we can do is know what our baggage is and try to work around it, so that if we all bring our baggage together, maybe we'll have a picture that is more accurate. The fourth or the fifth context is that the history that I'm going to be talking about is also a history, not that I'm talking about as a historian, but it's a lived history, which means I lived it, and I'm telling it differently because I lived it. And I think that's important to know. I made part of this history happen, so I have a particular stake in it. Now, in feminist theory, and some of you know this, just as a little review, we always believe the personal is political. And in the academy, teaching women's studies, we said not only was the personal political, but the academic is both personal and political. So that everything that we know, all knowledge as it is written, comes from a particular perspective. And if you come with a perspective, for instance, that women's lives are trivial, you're not going to bother to study them, which was, of course, the case for decades. And if you don't believe that it's important that, or if you do believe that women, it's important that men, husbands, are not allowed to rape their wives, that's not simply a personal issue in your home, that's a political issue and has to be fixed through the system. So these are important concepts that we have to be looking at. The fact that Jews, and I think this may still be the case, I can't talk about all universities and colleges, but Jews, when we first started to talk about multicultural work, very frequently Jews were sort of disallowed. If Jewish students said, well, I want to write about my history as a Jew, said, no, that's not ethnicity, that's not multicultural. Multicultural, and of course it happened because the focus at that moment in history was on trying to right certain wrongs of people, of raciality, of Native Americans, of African Americans, of Hispanic people, who were written out of history, and of course were appropriately included, but Jews were just seen as a white, middle-class group, no matter how small. I didn't give you the statistics, because I'm sort of not really looking at my text, but I wanted to mention to you that how astoundingly few we are and how many we were in these activism. Jews, if you look up wherever the history is, between 1.2 and 2.5% in the United States. Within one of the most famous collectives of the time, how many of you read Our Bodies, Ourselves? That is the work of a Boston collective that was founded way back in the early 70s as a teaching tool. It was used for classroom use. And then it became so widely read that it quickly became translated into, now it's I think up to at least 25 languages. It sold more than 4 or 5 million copies, and really all over the world. It is a way, and it's, I mean, obviously women use it in order to understand our bodies, but men read it too. Men do need to understand women's bodies too. That would be a good idea if they did anyway. This is an amazing book. There were 12 women in that collective. 8 of them were Jewish. So, and that's quite a large percentage. And according to this book that I'm going to mention by Joyce Antler, everything that I'm telling you about these statistics, and in the other collectives, it was usually about 2/3 to 3/4 of the women were Jewish. Now, historically, that's also been true in other progressive movements within the United States and in Eastern Europe, and I don't want to focus on that, but there has been, what interests me is this question, why? And one of the major hypotheses put forward is that because of the concept of tikkun olam, which is so deeply embedded in at least modern Jewish life, but the reality is that those people, those Jews who are most active politically, are the least religious, and many are just simply secular. So how could it be that the religion influences the politics if the Jews themselves who are active are not religious? Now here comes in this little bridge. I've always said, when I went around teaching about anti-Semitism, that Jews are not simply a religion. We are an ethnicity, we are a culture. I might even go so far as to say we are a people. We are not a nation. And I just want to make that clear, but when I heard this morning that we were going to be a nation, it frightened me. Whereas being a people and an ethnicity seemed like a fine thing to be. Complex, we're not just one thing. And of course our history and our culture is infused with a religion, because Jewish history is also biblical history. So there is that strong overlap. So now I'm up to the women's liberation movement, and you probably all here know that it grew out of the ferment of the 60s and 70s and all the different ferments, the civil rights movement, the peace movement, the students' rights movement, even the gay rights movement, and the aging movement was beginning at that time. And so it was through these groups where women of all kind were very active, became conscious as women because we were relegated to typing and mimeographing and making coffee. And so out of that grew the ferment of the women's movement as women organizing as women. And this is where Jewish women's organizing becomes most salient. What's interesting to me is that until Joyce Antler's book, it's only a 2018 book, and I'm going to give a copy to our library since but it's the first book to really interview women who were active as, well, they weren't all active as Jews. The first part interviews women who were active in the early Now days and other called liberal groups, and she asked them to think back. Did being Jew, you didn't talk about it. what did it mean to you? Was there any connection between being Jewish and your activism? Now, you could say that's a leading question, but almost all of the women she interviewed said yes, they could see some connection. And some even said that maybe they didn't talk about being Jewish because there was a certain amount of shame, a certain amount of fear. And others said, well, we were so American that it didn't seem to matter. So there's a whole spectrum of that. And then she also interviewed women who were active as Jewish women. And of course, then that brings in a whole other sense of what the histories were. I myself, to tell you the truth, even though I had something of a Jewish education, the best part of it was the Yiddish, which stood me in good stead for my dissertation on the influence of Yiddish theater on Kafka, but also working with Isaac Bashevis Singer. If I hadn't known Yiddish, I wouldn't have worked with him. But through my Brooklyn College, I went to a school that was so heavily Jewish that, and I didn't like those, so I wasn't Jewish. I mean, I was not Jewish, but it didn't matter very much. And even when I went to Yale Graduate School, which was quite anti-Semitic, and then Williams College when I was married to a man, and that was very anti-Semitic, it didn't sort of come forward. It wasn't until the women's movement, until after I came out as lesbian actually, that it really hit home, because here I was taking risks. I was talking to people and saying, homophobia exists in the world and we have a right to exist and we're not going to be hidden. And at that time, you have to remember how vulnerable, even though there was a movement to support us, it was not easy to be out. I mean, you could lose your job, you could lose your children if you had any, you could lose everything. And many lesbians were kicked out of the academy. It was not a warm and welcoming place, believe me. When I once taught a course on just women, no, I taught a course on biography, and it was half women and half men. One of my colleagues came up to me and said, oh, I see you're teaching all women. It was like half women was that much too many. that really, it's hard to believe that, but that was the mentality. Or if we had a women's group and we're meeting somewhere doing political work, our boss walked in, the chair of the department, and said, oh, I see you're all alone, drinking wine alone. because women without a man was considered alone. I mean, so you have to get back to that mindset to understand how scary it was because even to come out as a feminist, because all feminists were considered lesbians, so that was a scary moment. But then within the lesbian feminist movement, when I would hear anti-Semitic remarks, like, oh, I Jewed him down, or, you know, when the important women's concerts were created on Rosh Hashanah, even whether or not you went to temple, you wanted your holiday marked and honored. So it was things like cumulatively that made me conscious. Oh my God, this is not a safe haven. I have to speak out. But then it wasn't so safe to be among Jews. Actually, we were excommunicated. I know you may not think there's such a thing as being excommunicated from Judaism, but a very Orthodox band of people from Baltimore came when we were giving a reading from Nice Jewish Girls and handed out excommunication pieces of paper saying we were no longer in Judaism. So this is, you know, it was a very hard time, and that's what really brought this consciousness into being. So what I'm wanting to do, and maybe I would like to get to my PowerPoint if we could do that. If not, I can say everything I have to say, it's just nicer with illustrations. What I was going to do is talk about Jewish women's activism and all that we did, both within Judaism and within feminism. And I was going to, what I said, I was going to move the margin to the center, and you can still hear this concept, whether or not I actually do it with illustrations. And that is, I don't know if many of you have read Bell Hooks, African-American feminist theorist, very important work. And she I probably danced around and probably not even there. Oh, no, no. Anyway, she has a concept, and one of her books is called From the Margin to the Center. And her idea is that if we only look at things in a linear way, like first this happened, and then that, and then that, and then over here on the margins, we'll get to the groups that are more marginal, nothing will ever change. We used to say you cannot add women and simply stir. You can't take a theory or a concept that you have, put in a few, sprinkle in a few women, and think that anything will change in any meaningful way. So what I thought I would do to help us decenter, is if I say I'm going to give you the little history of what Jewish feminists have done, what I'm really doing is calling forth what they call the unmarked category. Jewish feminist means Ashkenazi, white, Jewish, heterosexual feminists. And I would talk about them first, and then I talk about how different groups came in, and eventually I'd get to lesbians and other Mizrahi, maybe another. What I want to do is, as some theorists have suggested, is start with, oh no, I'm not starting with the Viewsonic, okay. It's all right if it's not so beautiful. Okay. What I thought I would do is talk a little bit about the work I did in putting together Nice Jewish Girls, a lesbian anthology, and see how that work both is specific and general at the same time. It's not just work that was done within the community. So I'll see if I can get over here and not ruin this by moving. Okay, I won't be on the picture, Eddie, maybe you can move that, so.
I can turn.
Okay, so I wanted to show you, there are 3 editions of this book. This book was really a very, very breakthrough book. Never before had the notion of being Jewish and lesbian been brought together. And by the way, we asked the rabbi about the labrys on there. That was a symbol of Amazonian feminism. And he said it was fine to put it in a Jewish star, but we really didn't want to offend anybody. So there were 3 editions of this book. This is the second one. I don't know if it's, oh, this was the first one. I can't seem to move it.
Okay, hold on. Why don't you, maybe I should turn this on?
Why don't you do this?
Yeah.
Okay, and I'll go back over here. So whether or not there are 3 editions, the first one was 1982, the second one was 1984, and the third one was 1989. The first 2 were by small feminist presses. The last one was by Beacon Press. But it was before its time. It sold a bunch of copies, but it didn't sell enough for them to keep it in print. Of course, by now, things have changed even within Jewish education, so that there would be a market, and I'm looking to see if it can be reissued and maybe brought up to date. So what I wanted to show you was, okay, can we move along? That's the 3rd cover, the last one. I want to show you images. There's one essay in the book, and it's by Joan Byron. Some of you may know her. She's called Jeb. This was taken in 1981 or 2 when she was very young. She's the first photographer, really, to take pictures of lesbians. I mean, this may seem really weird to you, but like, if you think about way back in the old days when people thought Jews had horns, and there are pockets in the United States that still do, the question is, what does a lesbian look like? And so she took a picture of herself. She actually took a picture of 2 women kissing, because there was no such image except in pornography. She also has become, any of you know her work, she's made films of all the marches on Washington, having to do with women's rights and gay rights and against the KKK.
What's her name? What? Her name
is Joan Byron. She's a Washington person, and she's known as Jeb, J-E-B, and she has films. And actually, the irony is that right now in New York City, there's a museum called the Lohman Museum. Her pictures are blown up the size of a wall on the outside of the building down on Worcester Street. And so it's an ongoing year-long project that they're going to be showing her images. And I'm curious whether she will show the ones from this essay, which are very specifically Jewish, because at this moment in history, that might not be such a good idea. I mean, or it might be a very good idea. See, I mean, I'm thinking that these strategies that we might have as Jews as to how to deal with anti-Semitism are very parallel to the strategies that feminists struggled with. We see the problem, how do we deal with it? What is the best strategy to fight against it, aside from speaking out and giving money and marching? So Joan has an essay in the book called "That's Funny, You Don't Look Like a Jewish Lesbian." And you all know that Jewish joke that this is from? Any of you don't know that joke? About the person who says to a man on the train next to her, "Are you Jewish?" "No." "Oh, come on, tell me, you can tell me the truth. Are you Jewish?" "Nah." "Oh, please." "All right, I'm Jewish." "That's funny, you don't look Jewish." And it may be very funny, but it's actually, which I do like to laugh at it, but it actually is like a Jewish Kohen, K-O-A-N, not the other Cohen, because it's very deep. It raises the question of like, what is it, what should a Jew, what does a Jew look like, what should a Jew look like? What do we, what does a lesbian look like? Do we look like anything? Why do we talk about looking like? I mean, it raises really very deep issues of visibility and safety and danger. Anyway, so next slide, if we can show it, is, this is Linda Holtzman. She's one of the first lesbian rabbis. And I've just put her up there. There is a book called Lesbian Rabbis, which we need to have in our library, stories of she was one of the first, and she lived a split life. She lived in one small town where she was the rabbi, and she went to Philadelphia for her personal life, which is at quite a cost, and she did that for many years. But I wanted to point out that Jewish women, Jewish lesbians, have changed Jewish liturgy and Jewish life incredibly. I mean, I don't have to spell out here all the girls' baby naming services and let alone bat mitzvahs, but the burying of the placentas that some people do, menopause, services for menstruation, for miscarriages, all the things that have to do with women's lives. There are now rituals that come from Jewish feminism. And there's as much within the lesbian community as outside of it, but I'm using her as an example of this. Marcia Falk, who created non-gendered texts and prayers. So the changes within Jewish life. I also wondering, we used Debbie Friedman's music here and in every show. How many of you knew she was lesbian? A handful, but she was closeted her entire life. She only came out in the obituary when she died at a very young age, not even 60, and it was in the New York Times obituary. But I knew her from the lesbian community, but she was afraid to be out. Her music is transformed, really, much of Jewish life, and particularly youth responded to her kind of music, to her ways of being. And yet, if she had been out, she was afraid she and her music would be out too. That they might have kept the music and thrown her out. I don't know. I mean, it's just I'm referencing Bertolt Brecht, who talked about his plays having a bitter pill. People like to sing the music and spit out the bitter pill that was at the heart of his work. Okay, so let's move right along. Lesbians began having children. So this is a picture of we have a Jewish lesbian group that's been going on here in Washington for like 35 years, having a lesbian Seder every year, having Hanukkah parties. And the Seders are both the same and different because they're more inclusive, but they are feminist Seders and focus a lot on the women and also a lot on raciality and on racism and toward creating a different and better world. But what's also interesting, as you can see, the little children, these are adopted from Costa Rica. There's the whole question of what is a family. Children were adopted, they were done by surrogacy, and all of these things that are now in the dominant culture, not only in the Jewish culture, were really very much at the heart and started by Jewish feminists and Jewish lesbians. So the whole question of what is family. Next, please. In this book was one of the first times that in the lesbian world and in the Jewish world, these are two women, they are just good friends. One is African American, and the other is, she's very mixed. Rachel Waba she called herself stateless. She was born in Bombay, she was raised in Kobe. Her father was Iraqi and her mother was Egyptian, and they were thrown out of Iraq. Jews were thrown out in the 50s and 60s, and they didn't have anywhere to go, and their passports were taken away from them as citizens of those countries. So this was really important to talk about Mizrahi Jews, something that really wasn't very much talked about. And feminism really did bring that in. There's a wonderful woman called Lulu Khazum, who was extremely active at Columbia University. She wrote in journals like Lilith, like Bridges, really important feminist work, but bringing it to mind and to larger Jewish communities. This is work that was not just stayed in one community and stayed there. It really resonated out beyond many. So I think that these are very important contributions. Okay, the next one will go quickly. It's just a lesbian lawyer who was at that time considered old, because a lot of the lesbians were young, and it was a very youthful movement. I was probably one of the oldest because I came to it kind of late in life. But she was a lawyer. She did a lot of activism and peace work, but she also was representative of age and aging within. And now, of course, we have wise aging here, but it took many, many years for the topic of ageism to be.
Who is that?
Her name is Renee, I have to look up her last name, she only put herself.
Okay.
She lived in Chicago. And this image was taken like in 1987. So. Anyway, okay, next this is a really important arena. Who comes next? Yeah, Maxine Feldman. The women's music, how many of you went to women's music concerts? Feminists went, but women who were not feminist, women who were lesbian, women who were not lesbian, women's music really was a transformational part of creating the women's movement. And there were many, 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 many singers. Do people here like the name of Meg Christian or Holly Near probably came? All right, she came into the mainstream. But there were a whole array of singers, many, many lesbian, many Jewish lesbian, who created the field of women's music and women's concerts, which at first men were not encouraged or even allowed to come, and later on men were invited because it became clear that we wanted to spread the word and make transformation wider. But Maxine Feldman was one of the first. She wrote things like Angry Atheists and Amazon, but she always wore a big Jewish star. And people said to her, why don't you change your name from Maxine Feldman? And she always said, when Meg Christian, who was the other very famous, when she changes her name, I'll change mine. So she was an activist, and there is an essay, if any of you are interested, in Tablet magazine, there's just a 2 or 3 page essay that talks about the number of Jewish women who are in leadership roles within the women's music industry. For instance, I don't know how many of you know Sweet Honey and the Rock.
Yeah.
The manager of Sweet Honey is Amy Horowitz, a Jew. The women who created, what was the name of that company that where you went on the tour?
Olivia?
Olivia, very, very famous now. They had a record label, and now they have a travel agency for women. They have tours around the world for women. That's mostly put together by Jewish women. So if you want to, there's a long list, and I'm not going to give you the list, but it's a really, really almost scary. I mean, I have to confess, I'm both proud and scared at the same time for this. And then if you go on Facebook, I just happened to notice somebody saying that the owner, that who started the Rockettes and all the people who were the Rockettes are Jewish men. But I mean, it's very interesting what this issue that I started out with, that I thought was just going to be like an interesting thing to talk about, has become much more politicized. The next one, I'll go quickly so we have time for a few questions. This is my spouse, may she rest in peace, but she raised the issue of Jews by choice. Among Jewish lesbians, that was one of the first arenas in which Jews by choice were welcomed, they were open, because in many Jewish communities, Jews by choice were not considered real Jews. And so I think because, if I ask myself why, because lesbians were so way out from the mainstream, there is a way that there's a greater openness to less rigidity among things, even in things that don't specifically have to do with sexuality. And she used to teach in the world of higher education. She created, she used to use a model, something called the multicultural self. She would have the students create models like Calder, you know, those Calder mobiles, and they would put different pieces of themselves into the model to realize how multicultural we all really are, and how it's a balancing act to keep all the pieces in the air, but it does mostly work till it falls down. Anyway, okay. This is a very famous lawyer, Michelle Zavos. Many of you may know her. She may be some of your lawyers. This was taken like when her daughter, who she birthed, Addie, was just a year old. This is her first gay and lesbian march. But I wanted to talk about the fact that she is a lawyer for second parent adoption. I don't know how many of you know that if a couple that's not a heterosexual married couple adopts a child and something happens to one of the partner whose child it is biologically, the other person has no rights. The family can take the child away, even to this day. So they developed something called second parent adoption, where a second parent can actually legally adopt the child who already has one parent. And she does incredible activist work. And I just want to give her credit. It's not simply within the lesbian movement. And then the last two are activist slides. This one may not seem like much, but to have seen a sign that says another Jewish lesbian for peace and freedom, the idea that you were not the only one, that there were others out there, was an incredibly empowering moment, and a moment that opened things up. And then one more. I'm going to end with this one. This was taken at a rally against the KKK, where we're going to be marching in Washington. And this woman talks about the fact that she's a kike dyke, using all the negative terms, trying to reclaim them, transform them. No more lynching, no more Holocaust, no more witch hunts. And she was spat upon by other people there because of the fact that she was Jewish there, or that she was lesbian. It's hard to know which, but the activism is strong. And I'm not, oh yeah, maybe see if I have one more slide. I have to talk about the Jewish witch. Yeah, I'll end with the Jewish witch. She's doing a tarot reading, and this seemed way out in the 80s. Oh my God, I thought, can we really show this? But in the years to come, there's now a whole movement of reclaiming. Do you know about the Kohenet movement? Actually, it's a Kohenet. It's a movement that tries to bring Jewish women into leadership. They have two training programs, one in the East Coast, one on the West Coast, and they bring in all goddesses and all different streams of ancient Judaism to transform ritual and to make it meaningful for women. So this is, she happened to be a nice Jewish girl, but what she represents is a pretty wide movement of transformations that really even go beyond what we consider transformations here of what Judaism can look like. So I'll just conclude, I have no real conclusion, and which is good, and with the questions and of like, what strategies can we use? How shall we think about our history? How shall we use our history for the present? I don't have any answers, but I have many questions, and I think that it's important for us to realize our history and then to see what we can do with it that would be useful and usable for the future to make it better. So that's the end.
Thank you. Evi, are you open for questions?
Of course.
The protocol. I have the microphone. You raise your hand. Evi indicates who she'd like to hear a question from. You ask a question. I'll bring you the microphone.
So as far as I know, Kohelet means
Kohenet.
Kohenet?
Yeah, like Cohen.
Kohen, okay. I thought it was Kohelet. I couldn't figure out what
No,
connection
Kohenet.
to Ecclesiastes might be. Okay.
Kohenet, as in Kohen.
Mhm.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Other questions? Come on, you've got to have a question. Okay.
Comments would be welcome too, the right ones. Maybe.
That was terrific, thank you.
Oh,
Could you talk a little bit about the various waves of feminism? First wave, second wave, and I believe we're in the third wave now?
That's what they say. I'm still stuck in the second wave. I mean, I'm not sure that I think the first wave was at the turn of the century and sort of seemed to, historians write that it ends with when women got the vote. That was like the end of that. We got the vote, it's enough. We did not transform the world. We were just happy to vote. The second wave started, as I said, in the early 60s, mid-60s, and went on. And what's going on now is there was a lot of when I was in college, they always used the word co-optation, Marxists used it, and I never understood what they meant exactly until the feminist movement. Now I see what they mean. Many of the things that we fought for as feminists were taken into the structures so that they appear still to be there, but they're no longer radical. They're no longer transformative. But it is better than it was. So I'm not going to say we should go back. But so I'm not sure that what's happened now is that a lot of younger feminists are focusing on gender identity seems to be a much bigger issue than it was when I still believe in women. But there are people, that women in addition to being gender fluid, which seems to be a very big thing on college campuses and beyond these days. But I still believe that there are such things as women and that we still are oppressed. So I'm not sure that there's any new wave. We need to keep on waving the old flags and moving forward at the same time that we take in new ideas and try to transform our own, because it is easy to get stuck in your own way of thinking. Transgender is an idea that wasn't really very deeply embedded in the movements that I was in. So it's a new learning, but we all have to try to, I think feminism has that capacity to make us open and keep moving ahead and not just stop at a certain point. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Can I just make
So
it
Evi,
fast?
thank you for a marvelous historical review of where we are today and how we got there. One of the things that has happened was that synagogues would not marry gay couples, and they finally,
Harry, could you put a little closer to your mouth, please?
oh yeah,
Thanks.
okay. One of the things that hard time was for the synagogues to marry gay couples. And my daughter went to the conservative movement and said, you cannot bar and bat mitzvah these children at 13 and then deny them the right of marriage in the same synagogue where they belong. So that came to pass. Now conservative and of course Reform synagogues will perform gay and lesbian marriages. But that took a lot of effort down to the line of whether you all quit belonging to a synagogue if they will not marry you. So those issues are local, universal, and so on, and I'm sure it's in other countries as well. So thank you for that lovely talk.
I am not sure how to frame this question, so I'll just say it the best way I can. I am very interested in
Social class.
classism. And, well, it's social and it's other things.
And
And how
economic.
this fits in, because that thread is still here, and it always has been. It just changes. So I'm interested in what you have to say about that.
Okay, the question has to do with social and economic class, which I neglected to mention. Nice Jewish Girls did address issues of class, socioeconomic class, because that, of course, is one of the ways in which Jews are, as you heard Trump the other day about talking to the realtors, that, you know, you'll have to vote for me because, you know, you're all money makers and money grubbers. So Jews and money is a hot issue, and poor Jews or Jews of low socioeconomic class were really disappeared. You're really quite right. And that is also a very important differentiation among Jews. So it definitely, I don't know what else to say, except yes, it's probably, we don't pay enough attention to it. Frequently, some of the feminist journals and things like Tablet might have issues. Yes, there are Jews who are on welfare, Jews who really don't have enough to live by, Jews who are isolated, who are living alone and not paid attention to. So I don't know what else I could say about that, except it is an issue. But on the other hand, it is probably true that Jews in the United States, in general, are more middle class than not, toward the middle class.
Maybe different in New York.
What?
Maybe a little different in New York City. More Jews who are, I can't talk very well. Maybe more Jews in, say, New York City who are working class.
Maybe, yeah, it probably is also absolutely regionally, and it probably isn't paid enough attention to, I would agree. And it is an issue.
I'd also suggest that it's age-related, that the elderly are not necessarily as well-to-do as we like to think they are.
Right. But there were Jewish women, there were Jews who were brought up as children even years ago in poverty. Sure.
So I'd like to go back to the why question, which I think is a fascinating question. And I came of age born from a mother who was a housewife. I think many of us had mothers who were housewives, and yet I benefited from the entire social change that was happening. I had a career, I had children, I had all the whole 9 yards. And then talking about Tikkun Olam, because Tikkun Olam is the core value of Judaism in many ways, also part of the Christian faith. So I think it goes way back, because we look at the Emma Goldmans and the liberated Jews before Hitler, many of whom were women. Women were leaders of social justice movements. And I think leaders of social justice movements sometimes look around that social justice movement, as we all did in the 60s, and say, why are these guys putting their shit on us? You know, why is this happening to us, even in this social justice movement? And speaking out because of that clear dichotomy, out of a consciousness that it was really fundamental principles of fairness, equality, love, compassion, all those fundamental values. And it is the teaching of Judaism for many, many generations, that compassion means nothing unless it's in action. And I think that is the fundamental impetus behind many of these movements. So that's just my thought. And I think it continues to grow into other movements and continues to be needed in the feminist movement.
I'd also like to suggest that education plays into why Jewish women are active.
Well, I think it is, so there is a correlation between education and activism, yes, there has been, at least in our time.
So I've heard from your friend and mine, Claire Moses, that within the women's studies movement, maybe the Women's Studies Association movement, there's a very strong, virulent anti-Israel strand that makes it impossible for somebody who is pro-Israel, strongly pro-Israel, but critical of the Israeli government policies, to find a place. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I guess I almost kind of avoided the I word because it is so painful and so contentious. And yes, I mean, I think that within feminist studies there was, an edict about BDS, the boycotting of Israel, the academic boycotting. I mean, the same quarrels that are going on everywhere are going on within the National Women's Studies Association and within feminist circles in general. I think that it is a very difficult time for people who believe in the existence of Israel but are critical of it to find a place that doesn't appear to make them fall over one place or the other. It's a very dichotomized world we're living in, and I can only hope that it's not going to get better unless the politics get better. And as long as the politics remain fixed, I don't see how we can get out of it. And you can see the impulse to critique from people who don't have a stake in Israel, and that's to go back to standpoint. I think if you are raised within a certain, if you're raised either Jewish or if you're deeply within the Jewish community, you see Israel differently. What do we see? What do we look at? Right. People choose what they look at and what they're willing to see. So I think that the standpoint we come from really does make a difference. And the majority, we are still only 1 to 2.5% of the population. Right. Our standpoint doesn't have a lot of resonance to people who essentially don't care. I'm sorry, we can't end on a bad note. We have to end on a note of hope.
So here we have the last two questioners.
Okay.
So you mentioned that currently or gender issues is the thing that young feminists are focusing on. Are there other issues with regard to, women's issues like pay equality and other things that
yes,
being looked at?
I think there is a resurgence. The Me Too movement obviously had its roots in or certainly was taken up by many young people. I think issues of like sexuality and being abused, that seems to have greater prominence right now, because I think a lot of young women don't seem fully to grasp what the work world is like, or what the disparities in the work world is like, or what's in store for them once they get in there. And one of the things that we try to do as women's studies teachers is to prepare them for that world. But I think that will have a resurgence. Or it's not ever been dead, but it's not on the forefront, I don't think, right now. Now, I haven't been teaching women's studies for a while. I keep my eye on what's happening, but I have, been away from, I became a psychologist after although I was a feminist psychologist, and had to do just for your information, the very same work we did in women's studies and within Judaism and within, I had to do in psychology. I wrote a piece on, you know, the need to understand Jewish identity within psychology, because I would see people bring cases forward where the young woman was difficulty, she had a nose job, her mother was a Holocaust survivor, and the psychologist never seemed to had to question, did this have anything to do with being Jewish? I'm not kidding. I mean, it's like my mouth would hang open.
Right.
But that is so the work continues, it's never ending, but it's joyful, I think, I hope. But let's, as Emma Goldman said, oh, it was gonna say, and if I can't dance, it's not my revolution.
I like that.
I'll be tangential to pick up on your point. I'm a psychologist also.
Oh,
and at one
perfect.
point, I was supervising a non-Jewish younger psychologist who came in and was talking about one of his patients who he saw as so enmeshed with his family because he talked to them once or twice a week. I said, you know, what cultural background? Well, he's Jewish. And, you know, there was no understanding. That's him. Thank you so much. I'm wondering if I have a somewhat jaundiced point of view as someone who was involved in some of the second wave feminism. When I look at what's happening within feminism now, it sometimes seems to me that there's a bit too much identification with victimization and less identification with empowerment. And I wondered if you had any thoughts along those lines.
Well, I'm not sure, truthfully. I don't know that I mean, the Me Too movement was both, because they saw the focus on victimization as empowering and speaking out. So I'm not sure that it's either or. I think that, you know, and I would like to see more activism, more actual work being done in the world. But I think it is happening. It is happening. Since we're mostly not here from women's studies, I have to double check to find out from my colleagues whether that's really true. I couldn't.
Women don't pay for themselves on their dates, first dates anymore.
Well, there has been a certain sliding. I mean, many. And there's name taking. Many women know. We fought for our names. We started with Judy Chicago. Many women are taking on their husbands, those who are getting married, taking on their husbands' names, although some are hyphenating, so the names can get pretty long, but it does happen. So. Life is complicated, and as I used to say, as many problems as we solve, the solution to them also creates more problems or new ones. So we're in a movable feast, and hopefully will continue.
Thank you very, very much. Friends, I have announcements. Other people do too. Mine is in January 8th. Susan Subak is going to be speaking with us about understanding our emissions. Finding low carbon culture in the United States. I mean, she's got a book. Those emissions, yes. My grandsons entertained me with readings from the FARC dictionary to go to the other emissions. But Francie's got something to say, but before Francie, we have a wise aging